He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I started to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
This week's episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host Taylor, and for this week's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into cohabitating and coexistence, primarily of Bigfoot and other creatures. And yeah, let's get into this. So what is cohabitating exactly? Essentially, to live or exist together, something prominently displayed in the animal kingdom, of course. For example, ostriches and zebras, plover birds and crocodiles, rufous woodpeckers and tree ants. But why do these creatures all live in harmony together? There are a few different reasons. Living in groups help avoid being eaten by predators, for example. Some may actually work together to take down a larger prey, but all of it can be broken down into 4 basic groups, and these are the scientific terms for these different relationships. You have mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and competition. Very, very different last term there. But I'm sure many of you have seen Finding Nemo, the classic Disney Pixar film. Well, you can see that our friendly clownfish is living in a sea anemone, and that is a perfect example of one of these relationships. So in this mutualistic relationship, it's where both species are benefiting. The clownfish have a mucus that covers their body, protecting them from the toxic stings of the sea anemone, and they lure other fish in for that sea anemone to feast on, while in return, it offers protection for the clownfish. So that is the mutualistic relationship that benefits both parties. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did an episode on orang moaz, and in one of the articles I was researching, I found a very interesting note, and this was more or less, well, hypothetical, a hypothetical note of just the concept of them coexisting with another species, specifically birds. Hence this interest in Sasquatch maybe doing the same thing. I thought this was a very interesting path to maybe pursue. And if you've been tuning into our previous episodes, you'll know that me and Reuben, we like to kind of pick a topic that exists out in the real world, in the animal kingdom, and see how that actually could apply to a Sasquatch or cryptids of all different shapes and sizes. So as we talk more about mutualism, it's funny that it's actually represented by a fair amount of primates. There are some species pairs which we see together in the wild quite a bit, and sometimes they have a lot of interaction and stay together for long periods of time. They play together, groom each other, and sometimes even eat with each other. And here's an interesting note, though. As per last week's episode, we discussed cases of people being both abducted and just coexisting with them. Now, that doesn't stop at humans, though, but other cryptids, including Dogman. While that information is exceptionally difficult to track down, there have been cases where a dogman and a Bigfoot are seen standing together. Whether it be hunting or passing by is beyond me, but there are some intriguing claims associated with it. So I hope I explained that right. All in all, are they living in a very mutualistic relationship? Could not say for certain, but there are sightings where both two different cryptid species are interacting with each other. So fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But let's circle back on the Bigfoot and birds notion here. Many birds like robins, blue jays, and cardinals, they actually will feed on parasites like fleas and ticks. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, you can imagine how helpful that would be to have. My personal favorite discovery was learning that quail are actually used in biological tick containment projects. Quail are essentially powerhouses when it comes to eating up ticks. And ticks are everywhere. Once the heat starts coming in, and like we're talking like 30 to 40 degrees easily here, like at least right now, and we're not even in summertime really. Yeah, we're still in like early June. So the ticks are just wild. I've had a few that have latched onto me and I've had to take care of them, but you can imagine something living full-time 24/7 out in that bush. You're going to get a lot of them. Now, depending what you choose to believe in with Sasquatch, if it is a flesh and blood creature, it must be subject to fleas and ticks like humans and other animals would be, right? Unless it is a being with heightened abilities stemming from another reality. Maybe that includes its own tick deterrent. But let's say it is flesh and blood. I don't think they have those specialty tweezers out in the forest or the sprays or anything like that. I'm somewhat pushing us towards another type of co-habitable situation. And this is, as mentioned earlier, parasitism. Now, I created that hypothetical situation above. So let's hypothetically debunk it. Without knowing exactly what Sasquatch smells like, and only having people's encounters as a reference point, I think it's okay to say that sulfur, that rotten, decaying smell, is the most fairly commonly attributed scent to Bigfoot. Well, as per the United States Department of Agriculture, sulfur itself is a great repellent for ticks and fleas, so much so that it's recommended to sprinkle a little bit onto your pants if you're out in the bush and to use it in your gardens. Now, note that it doesn't repel mosquitoes, but it's cool to bridge that idea of them having possibly a natural deterrent for parasitic creatures. This would as well ultimately eliminate the need for a bird species to coexist with them and help clean up the pest problem. Let's also clear the ground here on human and pet relationships. While there is certainly a bond between a human and their pet, be it a dog, cat, bird, heck, even raccoons, there's some crazy animal-human relationships out there, but I would attribute this more to a multi-generational scenario of a species that has been met with human intervention in some form. Dogs are a great example of that to the core, I would say. And yes, there is a mutual exchange of benefit between a pet and a human for survival. Humans get happiness, that mental reprieve, while also benefiting from certain awareness situations. When you're out in the woods, even in your own home, that dog offers safety and security and alert. I use this as a reason for Bigfoot not taking on pets. I think this creature has become so elusive that other forms of wildlife know of its existence, but the only company a Bigfoot keeps is itself or its family group. No pets. Well, maybe of course the odd human, as we already discussed. But having no animal pets doesn't mean we can disregard commensalism. This is another form of co-habitable relationship that we mentioned earlier between animals, and in this instance, one species benefits while the other achieves no benefit and no harm. This leads me to think, what if Sasquatch uses other animals as an alert system? Perhaps this is where birds could come into play for Sasquatch. So, that sound you just heard was from an American robin. It's one of the few alarm callouts that they can perform depending on the predator, whether it's aerial or on the ground. I did find some notes of them having specific calls for humans approaching as well. So while the robin would receive no benefit or harm from a Sasquatch, it provides a wonderful benefit to the cryptid. Now, not all Sasquatch live in family groups, I imagine, so the ones that are out on their own can rely on nature's very own reliable security system, the American robin. Now, moving on, not all scenarios do the woods go silent, for context. And, people, they may be in a situation where a Sasquatch has made itself known and the woods just completely go silent. You don't hear bugs, you don't hear birds. And then that might create a little bit of conflict here if a Sasquatch is using a bird as an alarm system, because would you not hear the bird? Most people report that the woods go silent. So for context, when I was little, I could easily tell when my parents were angry at something. I get so in tune with it that in many cases, I would completely shut down and be quiet so they could just be angry at whatever it was making them angry, and it would pass. So with Sasquatch, many people take note during an encounter of how silent it gets. Like, again, the forest just identifies this creature, that it's nearby, shuts itself down. This isn't 100% fact each time, though. In many cases, people are doing their own thing. All of a sudden, they spot the cryptid, but there's no preconceived notion of warning. So while I do believe a Sasquatch could rely on the calls of birds and other natural red flags to evade areas where humans are approaching, I absolutely would believe that in certain situations, animals would leave or shut themselves down like I did when I was younger. And you're dealing with an alpha predator, the dominant force of the Pacific Northwest. It's just approaching an area where perhaps it's just not happy that a human is in. It's getting angry, and the forest can sense that energy. And that's when everyone's just like, okay, they're mad. We're gonna shut down. So this kind of leads us to our fourth co-habitable scenario called competition. And this is where two things coexist, but it's a negative outcome for both parties. And I can't think of a better situation here or explanation than the Sasquatch human relationship. Humans, we need room to grow. We tear down forests so we can throw in a new subdivision. Now, maybe this area is a place where Sasquatch resides. Resources are often limited in a habitat. Could be a natural water supply nearby or a proficient food area for hunters. But ultimately, many species will compete to get a hold of this. Believe it or not, plants are actually a great example in a garden, as they may compete with each other for soil, nutrients, water, and light. And we discussed this before, but loggers being attacked while on the job site, equipment being banged up, rocks tossed, vocalizations galore, it's just nuts. Sure, the fact that trees are being cut down is not ideal by any standards for a Sasquatch, but the fight for an area is definitely made example of in this co-habitable scenario. I do want it on record that not all Sasquatch encounters are bad. Many people report, albeit still scary, situations that aren't subject to being attacked or anything. And it's hard to determine which category that falls into when you spot a Sasquatch and it spots you and you both carry on with your lives. Indigenous tribes and families have shared amazing coexisting tales where Sasquatch act as great protectors, and you can align that in maybe like a mutualistic relationship. But there are, of course, those negative scenarios where they're stealing children, food, and livestock, and then you can align that in one of the more negative cohabitable relationship terms. So those are the four definitions of cohabitating and how it could or could not necessarily apply to Sasquatch. It does make me wonder how this could be attributed to other cryptids, but that's certainly a discussion for another day. But with all that talk about cohabitating, let's just discuss a little bit here about the Sasquatch habitat in general. Pacific Northwest, prey, predators. In terms of its living location, I find this difficult to research because many reports say that because of climate change, it would provide positive and negative benefits to Sasquatch, in the sense that they will lose some of their coastal and lowland areas in the Northwest, but gain more territory farther north and in the Canadian Rockies. I don't have much ground here, but I do feel like I am inclined to disagree with this, because I think if they lose a territory, they aren't gaining a new one. Sasquatch probably already frequents the Canadian Rockies. Everywhere that we think that they would retreat to, they probably already retreated there and have their own home base. But let's also just note here, the Rockies have a rich amount of caves and subterranean systems, but I digress. You already know where I stand with cave networks. My main point on this is that wherever there is wild forest, I reckon Sasquatch could go there. And should the coastal regions flood and it force people further inland to the forests, well, that would again just compromise and push Sasquatch back further and deeper into the wild. You'll see more of the habitable relationship competition unfold here as humans get more aggressive with their expansion into deeper forests, unless, of course, these beings just simply go and hide in national parks. But do I consider human beings a predator? Not necessarily. We fit that prey category pretty well when compared to Sasquatch. Now, I'm not disregarding humans as predators by any means, but most often, predators have eyes front-facing across a multitude of species, human beings included, and this is how we can just focus and target our prey. But humanity has definitely drifted away from being that predatory stance. We have technology that we hide behind, groups of people and packs, and so that's really where our predatory position comes from. But individually, you could put up maybe hopefully a good fight, but as a predator on our own, we're really detached from nature. And I think nature is the ultimate predator, especially when you have an alpha predator like a Sasquatch out there. Humanity doesn't really fare well. So if Sasquatch are forced to retreat, so too will the wildlife of which we are all too familiar with, like cougars and bears. Now, just for fun, I was looking into what the apex predator in North America was. And it actually prompted me to the killer whale, the orca, which I thought was pretty crazy. Out of everything that exists, it just defaulted to the apex predator in North America being underwater, the killer whale. It made me think about who would actually win in a fight, a killer whale or a Bigfoot. I would hate to see that because they're both very unique species. I don't want to see them fight each other. That aside, while on land, you have cougars, gray wolves, and grizzly bears. Now, they would probably fit the bill here. Wolf populations are subject to culling in parts of the country. Cougars and grizzlies, though, they're more on that rare side. And I'm going to pull that card and say, how many of you have actually seen grizzly or cougar bones in the woods? Just go sit on that. Even more experienced hunters, I'm sure, don't necessarily come across those remains, if ever at all. But that's a topic for another day. While these signature predators are powerhouses and could easily best us if we let our guard down, run away or be somewhat of an idiot out in their territory, I think they all choose to evade Sasquatch. The only concern Sasquatch probably has is with others of its own kind that mean to cause harm, and humans, but again, not from a predatory standpoint. I reckon that more of a parasitic position, like the parasitism-habitable relationship, would be involved here. And it's something that Reuben and I have talked about, where some groups of Sasquatch have made a point of like, okay, they're moving out because there's maybe another group coming in that's a little bit more negative. It's worth noting that when you get to the ocean coastlines along British Columbia, you're faced with dozens and dozens of islands and inlets, rich in natural resources for wildlife to thrive in. Lots of larger animals will actually island hop. This is something I mentioned to Reuben ages ago. When you take the ferries between the islands of the coast, you can sometimes see grizzly bears swimming to and from these islands. Deer and cougars, believe it or not, out swimming in the ocean. And it's really fascinating. The other week, actually, a photographer took a photo of an orca whale, and there was a deer, and they were both swimming adjacent to each other, like going opposite lanes when you're driving down the road, but they were directly passing each other. Neither of them had any interest in one another, but they were doing it. And again, island hopping. So now, as this episode does come to a close here, I have a Sasquatch encounter to share that was submitted to us. And it's interesting how it touches upon a couple little things that we highlighted in the episode, but I digress. And I quote, "I live in Western North Carolina in a very rural area. I'm familiar with the animals that live around me. So, one night around midnight, my animals began acting strangely. The chickens were awake, squawking loudly. The cats were on the roofs and under the buildings, growling loudly, and the dogs were whimpering and backed into the corners. So, my son and I went out to inspect the property and pens and see what had frightened the animals. On the back side of the property, we have an access path roadway that cut around a steep gully and goes back to the mountain ridge. We started to go down the path about 30 feet in front of us. All of a sudden was this thing. It was a dark figure standing on two legs. It turned its head and looked at us in a way that made me feel very threatened. It had blue eyes, or the eyes reflected blue in the light from the flashlight. It looked at us for a few, and then it walked down off the trail into the gully." End quote. Now, the whole encounter itself lasted for less than 1 minute. The following day, they actually went out to explore the area for tracks, but they were unable to find a single one. They did note the smell of decay, or at least something in the process of decaying, and that was there up until the occurrence. The following day resulted in no more horrible smells. So I want to say thank you for letting us share that encounter on the show. And I'm glad to know none of your animals were actually hurt and the occurrences stopped. It sounds like it was very much just curious and passing through. Having put up motion detectors and cameras, that also would probably deter a Sasquatch, I reckon. Having run into one of these things probably resulted in it considering a more remote approach and going somewhere far away where it won't be smelled and it's not going to be photographed or anything like that. So I think it definitely has backed off. And again, you don't want to lose your animals. that's definitely not. That's not good. No. With that though, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Cryptid Clues. We shall be back next week with some great new content. Be sure to check out our Patreon where you can get ad-free early episodes. You can find us on all social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And should you want to send us a message, reach out, say hi, you can do so at cryptidclues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.